Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Scrum, Politico's weekly podcast. I'm your host, White House reporter Reid Epstein, here at the Politico mothership. We're talking about the big topics in Washington this week. President Barack Obama embracing his go-it-alone efforts, the latest in the Christie Bridgegate saga, and perhaps some changes coming up at the NSA involving the President Obama is going to kick off Friday with his big speech on surveillance. For all of that, we have a great team of politicos, senior writer Todd Purdum, deputy White House editor Rebecca Sinderbrand, and making her podcast debut, political reporter Ellie Titus, fresh back from New Jersey, where she took a look at Christie. Before we get into these topics, let's start with your headlines of the week, Todd. What's the big story this week in Washington?
Well, jumping off President Obama's go-it-alone efforts, maybe this story is he has a martini just in the nick of time with these House members, the Senate Democrats this week. He had them over to the White House, and to their surprise, he actually served them cocktails. So maybe this means he's in a more expansive mood as the year begins, and maybe he'll work a little harder to lobby his friends in Congress.
Rebecca, what do you think?
Well, I have to kind of nod to what we're going to be talking about a little later. President Obama signals he's ready to go it alone again, some more. Which we've heard before, but he's making it clear he wants to make sure people have heard him. So the president's ready to strike out on his own.
And Ellie, what do you think?
I thought the headline on Ken Vogel's recent story was pretty apt. Christie's high-stakes weekend. The New Jersey governor does have a bunch of really important events on his schedule for Saturday and Sunday, including some meetings with some big donors that frankly could tell us a lot more about how this bridge mess is affecting him than anything else we learned this week. We'll
certainly know a lot more about Christie's political health after this weekend, after he comes out of these meetings with fundraisers. Let's start first with our first big theme this week. President Obama has made no secret what the theme of his State of the Union address is going to be that he's delivering a week from Tuesday. He's going to be the man of action, pursuing administrative changes while Congress dawdles up on the Hill. It'll be a bit of a challenge for the president to make some of these issues sexy. So far, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen him announce promise zones in 5 locations across the country without really saying that there's any federal funding involved. On Wednesday, we saw him go to North Carolina, where he introduced a manufacturing initiative that is truly important to the people in North Carolina, but doesn't have a whole lot of resonance elsewhere in the country. But perhaps the specifics of these issues don't matter as much as the optics of seeing the president active. The White House at the same time is launching an anti-poverty effort that will have as its centerpiece a minimum wage hike that will, of course, require congressional cooperation that he's not going to get. Todd, with the midterms approaching, is there a reason to believe that we're going to see a lot more of the president running around the country kicking off some of these sort of small bore initiatives, trying to build it into a broader theme, or are we going to see him beat up Congress a little bit for not being cooperative?
I think you'll see him doing a little bit of both. And in a way, I feel I've seen this movie before. It does remind me of what President Bill Clinton did in 1995 and 6 after the Democrats lost the Congress in 1994. He showed that it was really possible through a series of relatively small bore executive actions to get a lot of attention, to generate a lot of stories, especially in the local media markets. And these were things like school uniforms. Remember the V-chip that was supposed to control the kind of dangerous television programming that young children might watch, or violent programming.
It was very scary for those of us who were teenagers in the 90s.
Well, it's scary for those of us who were in our mid-30s. But these were mocked at the time, but he did have, drip by drip and bit by bit, he had a lot of success over those 18 months in getting people to think that he was the man of action and the Gingrich Congress was, Dr. No and resisting things and shutting down the government. And he looked like the man who had some ideas that were moving forward.
It also sort of reminds us of the "We Can't Wait" theme that he had in 2012, when he had a jobs bill that died in Congress, but it was something that the president talked about on the campaign trail. And just what do you know? We have a campaign trail coming up later this year. The midterm elections, the president is hoping to keep the Senate. There's sort of less thought that they'll win the House. But Rebecca, how much of this is political and how much of it is something that can actually get done?
Well, it's interesting because you have this kind of, this two-pronged kind of offense from the White House. On the one hand, we are hearing a lot more of the president talking about these kind of go-it-alone things he can do without Congress, things he doesn't need Congress's help to do. And on the other hand, we're also hearing this unified message from the White House and Capitol Hill and some of its allies in terms of Democrats talking about their 2014 agenda, trying to make sure the White House briefing members of Congress on what's going to be in the President's State of the Union, trying to get everyone on the same page in terms of the income inequality storyline. At least that's the early read in terms of what they're pushing. And so it's interesting to see both. And of course, we're at a very interesting point in the Obama presidency, where you get to with every presidency, where you're getting to that stage where you're not going to see much happening on Capitol Hill, particularly this year. So you're seeing a little bit of both.
Outside of Washington, we'll move to our second big story. Ellie, you went up to New Jersey to get the eyewitness view of what's going on with Bridgegate or Bridge Ghazi, or
I think we should call it Tollgate.
Tollgate.
Someone pointed out they never got to the tolls.
Sounds delicious then.
I feel like this story doesn't have quite the catchy enough nickname. Bridgegate doesn't seem like it's good enough for this. But this week, Christie delivered a chastened State of the State speech where he said there'd be no more breach of trust in New Jersey. We're seeing more details as more and more of these emails and texts come out from Christie's advisors. There's more hearings at the state legislature in Trenton. Bruce Springsteen got in on the act, parroting one of his songs on the Jimmy Fallon show. And like you said, Christie's headed to Florida this weekend to schmooze with big donors, raise money for Republican governors, and rub elbows with people who would just coincidentally be enormously helpful to a 2016 presidential campaign for him or anyone else. Ellie, sort of tell us what the next steps are in this story. What does Christie need to do to sort of regain his mojo, and how do we see him trying to do that?
Well, there is certainly a lot going on, starting with the sort of avalanche of documents that did come out in Trenton within the past week or so. I think what you see Christie doing is trying to take back at least some control of what people are talking about when they do talk about him. He was out in public on Thursday for a couple of events related to Hurricane Sandy recovery, and he was also slated to do a fundraiser for Steve Lonigan on Thursday night, the former Republican Senate candidate in New Jersey who is now taking a shot at a House seat. And then, of course, Christie is scheduled to go to Florida this weekend. And all this is, I think, trying to convey a message that he's, going ahead with his agenda and with his plans to, carry out the work of the Republican Governors Association, which he's leading now. And I expect to see a lot more of Christie sort of stepping out in the next, weeks and even months, even though all of these sort of inquiries and investigations will be going on at the same time.
And what was the sense that you got in Trenton from other state lawmakers in New Jersey? Are they giving him the benefit of the doubt? Christie's been in charge there for since his fifth year as governor. He's starting. Are people, state lawmakers, other Trenton officials, are they ready now that Christie shows some weakness to bite back at him or take some whacks at him that they might not have before all of this?
We're seeing some of that, and we're also seeing lawmakers acknowledge that there are some really key unanswered questions still. And so it's a mix of reactions, even though both chambers of the legislature are run by Democrats who have butted heads with Christie. It was State Senator Loretta Weinberg saying within the past couple of days that we still don't completely know what the motivation was for this traffic jam, these lane closures, and there's still a lot that we have to learn about why Christie's aides and appointees apparently carried those out as political retribution. And so you're hearing a lot of enthusiasm from lawmakers up in Trenton wanting to go forward with more subpoenas, but also pointing out that the story is not fully rounded out yet. Which is
and it's interesting that we haven't seen Christie try to put the brakes on any of these hearings. None of Christie's allies. You don't hear them saying, like you do in Washington with some of the House hearings, that the White House doesn't like, that the hearings are unnecessary or that they're over the top. It seems like they're cooperating sort of as best as best that one could expect them to.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent. You had Christie appointee to the Port Authority, David Wildstein, show up for a committee hearing in Trenton last week, but he pleaded the Fifth after he did provide some documents. So obviously that's not Christie directly coming out and saying that the legislative investigation is out of bounds or anything, but there was a little bit of struggle to get full cooperation there. And then also Christie on Thursday named a legal team to help him cooperate with all of these inquiries, and he named the U.S. Attorney's Office as one player who he's going to try to cooperate with. He did not name the legislative committees, and a spokesman for him actually wouldn't answer as to whether Christie considers those appropriate. So it's kind of up in the air.
A story that's going to have legs for weeks and months at this point, it looks like. Our third big story this week, we're recording this Thursday afternoon. President Obama on Friday morning plans to deliver a speech detailing his long-awaited reforms to the nation's electronic surveillance programs. He'll be at the Justice Department talking about many of these NSA stories that Edward Snowden, the former contractor, has unveiled to the public since June. Rebecca, what can we expect from the president here? It doesn't sound from sort of the nuggets that have been leaked out that there's going to be a seismic shift in the way the NSA does business here, but we can expect sort of more of the same types of themes from the president about welcoming the debate and how Americans don't need to be worried that he is reading their email or listening to their phone calls.
Well, that's absolutely right. And, we already know, even though the president has not formally unveiled which of the recommendations that he's prepared to adopt at this point, we already know the privacy and civil liberties advocates are bracing themselves for disappointment, as our Josh Gerstein is reporting. Not expecting much in terms of dramatic change from the president, obviously. We already knew that he wasn't going to be adopting all 46 of these recommendations from that Intel review panel wholesale. We knew that he was going to be picking and choosing. But the sense we've gotten in some of the reporting that we've been able to glean over time, and of course the administration has been briefing members of Congress, lawmakers, Hill aides, civil liberties advocates, and others on kind of what we're looking for or what's coming down the pike for Friday. But we're not expecting much in the way of dramatic change. What the administration is looking to do here is they're looking to turn the page. This is an issue they'd like to see in the rearview mirror. For as much as the president says he welcomes the debate, actually, the sense that you get, this is actually a debate he'd rather not have. And so, to the extent where, this event is taking place on a Friday before a 3-day weekend, not generally the time you put news or issues you'd like to highlight in particular. So I think that for the administration, the sooner they can get this behind them, the better.
And before the State of the Union, too, Todd, where the president can sort of get everything he has to say about this out and then allow the administration to say the president's made his point and refer people back to the speech if they have more questions about it.
It definitely is a problem for him, though, as Rebecca pointed out, because on this front, as in so many, whether it's detainees in Guantanamo or drone strikes or you name it, in areas of national security and anti-terrorism policy where he had vowed to hit the reset button and be an altogether different figure than George W. Bush, we now see that during his administration he has really continued, in some senses, augmented or expanded this kind of enormously growing national security state that began to take shape after 9/11, and he has not. I think you could probably argue that that's been the central failure of his record versus his promises in 2008. That's the area in which he's been able to make the least difference, I would say.
And as our colleague Olivier Knox of Yahoo pointed out Thursday morning, that the speech comes on the 53rd anniversary of Eisenhower's military-industrial complex warnings. The White House claimed it was a coincidence. Surely it is, but we'll see if the president flicks to that as part of his surveillance speech. We're going to take a quick break now for some programming notes. We'll be right back with more from our team and the highlights round.
Hey, podcast listeners. Of course, a big Playbook Cocktails event going on Thursday afternoon at 6 p.m. If you're able to watch, it is streaming live at politico.com/live. Mike Allen will be talking to former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates about policy, politics, and his new book, Duty: Memoirs of a Secretary at War. If you're getting this podcast after Thursday evening, it will be available on demand at politico.com/video. That's all that's on the schedule for now. Check back at politico.com/events for more information. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back to the Scrum. I'm here with Politico's Todd Purdum, Ellie Titus, and Rebecca Sinderbrand. It's time for our highlights round. We're going to touch on a couple big moments from the week, and we'll get your quick takes. Here we go, Ellie. It's another week, another set of retirements in the House. This week we saw Buck McKean and George Miller from California, Jim Moran from Northern Virginia. What does this tell us? What does it mean about sort of the House in 2014 and the midterms? Are we any closer to anything other than the status quo at this point?
Probably not. The Democrats still have pretty much an uphill battle to take back the House in 2014. And a couple of these retirements actually mean that Democrats will have to spend money defending seats that were held by Democrats who are now retiring, but that will become competitive. And this is despite what I believe House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi said on Thursday, which was that the retirements don't affect their sort of strategy and the landscape for them. They are putting dings in Democrats' chances, but I'm sure there are a few more retirements still to come in this season.
Yeah, I guess that's the question, Todd. How far along do we get in 2014 before there's no more retirements? Are these guys going to drop off sort of as we get closer to the primary deadlines?
Well, you'd think as you get close to the spring filing dates for the primaries, they'll have to say one way or the other, because it's an awful waste of their time and their donors' time if they mount a campaign and then they don't intend to run later. Or they also leave their parties in the lurch if they, drop out after a certain point. It's interesting because, the Moran retirement in Virginia, for example, that probably does help the Republicans make that seat, put it in play. But Buck McKeon in California, maybe that makes the seat a possible pickup for the Democrats. So it's kind of hard to predict exactly. The interesting question for President Obama is the Senate, and if the Democrats don't hold the Senate, and at the moment it looks like they will by the hair of their chinny chin chin, but if they don't hold the Senate, that could be a real problem for the last 2 years of the President Obama.
Well, he's certainly putting all of his 2014 efforts on the Senate side, meeting with senators at the White House Wednesday night. He had a big meeting with 2014 Democratic senators in December, really making it clear that he's on board with them and that he'll do whatever they need, or in some cases whatever to stay away from them.
Yeah. Some terribly tough races, Mary Landrieu in Louisiana, Jeanne Shaheen in New Hampshire, where Obamacare has come into play in both those cases, Blanche Lincoln in Arkansas, of course. It's a tough landscape for him.
Speaking of the Senate, on Thursday morning, former RNC Chairman Ed Gillespie formally announced that he's going to run against Virginia Democratic Mark Warner. He would be Virginia already elected a National Party Chairman Governor last year. We'll see if another one can get elected to the Senate. Can Gillespie really win, or is this something where he's setting himself up for a race down the line?
Well, he certainly has a big network from his career in Republican politics, and we've seen Virginia now elect former operatives who have turned into candidates themselves. But how Ed Gillespie sort of performs once he is in the spotlight is, I think, a little bit of an open question. It's interesting that until he indicated he was going to jump in, we didn't think Virginia was going to be really a state to watch Senate-wise this year, and we were all looking at Wyoming, and I think this speaks to how quickly things can change.
And it'll be a real test. Obviously there's a real difference between the staffers and the candidates. You sort of don't know what the bright lights are like until they're on you. But there are some, and in Virginia, and we saw this evidence with Terry McAuliffe the first time he ran in 2009. He was clearly not ready for prime time himself, but the second time he ran last year, he was a far better, far more disciplined candidate, and of course he beat Ken Cuccinelli.
Oh, absolutely. And particularly in that case, it just goes to show in terms of not just the skills he gained as a candidate himself, but finding your moment. This year, the midterm year, and particularly with Virginia having kind of bucked a tradition last year in terms of electing a Democrat at a time when generally in an off-year election, it's generally been that the party that occupies the White House tends to have a disadvantage when it comes to that particular race. And so it really is is kind of an interesting moment for a competitive race in Virginia also.
That's our highlights round. We'll go now to some shout-outs. We'll end the show. We'll go quickly around the table. Key reads, videos, follows, restaurants, things you enjoyed this week. We'll start with Rebecca. What's your big shout-out this week?
Well, you know what? I'm going to give actually a shout out to a departing member of our own team. White House Bureau Chief John Allen is departing the Politicave and leaving us, but we would like to wish him the very best. We're going to miss him, and he's been a voice on this podcast now and again, so hopefully he'll still be listening.
And he may not have told you he has a book coming out about Hillary Clinton.
There's that. Well,
next month.
You may have heard.
Called HRC.
That's right.
There was a big excerpt in Politico magazine this week that you should check out called Hillary's Hit List. Todd?
My shout-out is Bill Bryson's great new book, One Summer, about the summer of 1927, when so much happened in America, from Lindbergh's flight to one thing after another that in some ways helped define modern America. And it's just like all of his books, a great, gripping read about things you never knew and are glad to know.
And Ellie?
I'll give a shout out to a couple of places in Trenton that allowed me to file stories recently when I found myself there for the first time. Public Library down the street from the State House has pretty good Wi-Fi. And the McDonald's in the Trenton Amtrak station will do in a pinch. So I appreciate both those places.
Nothing Politico reporters like better than places with free Wi-Fi that functions and allows you to file quickly on the road is invaluable. Todd, Rebecca, Ellie, thanks for coming on the show. If you want to see even more on these stories, head to Politico.com. You can find this podcast at Politico.com/podcast. We're also on iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. Just search Politico Podcast. I'm Reid Epstein. That's the Scrum, and thank you for listening.